Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Kidlit Pride High School is Murder panel. I am John McDougall. I am the event coordinator at Murder by the Book in Houston. We are one of the country's oldest and largest mystery bookstores. Before I was at Murder by the Book, I was a bookseller at Borders for 10 years. And before that, I was also, I worked at one of the only LGBT coffee shops here in Houston. So I've been in the book world for a super long time. I'm so excited to be able to do this today. Thank you guys so much for asking me to help moderate this. So I'm going to briefly introduce everybody and let them give a chance to tell you a little bit about themselves and their books. We're going to start with Ryan Douglas. He is an author and a freelance writer. His debut novel is a Get Out-inspired YA thriller out through Penguin and Putnam in summer of 2021. How are you today, Ryan? I cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
My bad. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can.
Hi, I'm good. Should I introduce myself and talk about what?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about your upcoming book.
Okay, so my book is called Jake in the Box. It's about a Black teen queer medium who gets haunted by the ghost of a school shooter. And he has to essentially master his powers of mediumship and find his voice at his school in order to banish this evil spirit. So it's, I mean, we pitched it as a Get Out inspired novel. I actually finished it before I even saw that movie, but it's a Black horror novel, so it's kind of in that Jordan Peele vein.
All right. Next up, we have Krystyn Lambert. Her first debut novel, called The Boy in the Red Dress, which is a historical mystery set in 1929 New Orleans, just came out a couple of months ago. How are you today, Krystyn?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Well, you kind of said it all, but but my book is about this bi girl Millie who works at an underground speakeasy, and her best friend is the star of the show there, Marion the drag queen, and he is accused of murder, and they don't think the cops will give him a fair shake, so they decide to solve the murder themselves and go on some She-Ra-esque found family shenanigans in the process, and it's of course murdery, but then cover some serious topics, but it's just mostly fun.
We also have Malinda Lo with us. She is the critically acclaimed author of several young adult series, including most recently A Line in the Dark, which is a standalone thriller. She also recently released the 10th anniversary edition of her novel Ash and has another new one coming out early next year. How are you today, Malinda?
Hi, I'm good. Yeah, it's great to see you all, except I am adjusting to this Google format because as Krystyn said, we're very tiny in the corner. So I wanted to show you this cover. I can't really see it. Can you see it? It's the hand cover. So this is what I'm talking about today. It's A Line in the Dark. It's my psychological thriller about this queer Chinese American girl in New England who is kind of in unrequited love with her best friend, and it's about the secrets they keep from and for each other. Yeah, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah. And finally, we are joined by Tom Ryan, who is the author of several acclaimed books for young readers. His most recent release is Keep This to Yourself, and upcoming he's got I Hope You're Listening, which is out in October. How are you today, Tom?
I'm great. This is really exciting. I'm happy that we were all able to get together from our various spots, and yeah, I started in contemporary. My first few books were contemporary YA, and then about 4 years ago I decided I wanted to focus my writing efforts, and because I've always been a big fan of mysteries and thrillers, I decided to take a crack at a YA mystery, and so this is Keep This to Yourself, which came out last year, and this is sort of a serial killer small town story about a gay boy whose small town was rocked by a series of murders a year before the story begins. And the final victim of this serial killer was his best friend and kind of unrequited love interest, who was his next door neighbor. And he finds a clue and decides to start digging into these unsolved murders, and things kind of spiral from there. And my next book is also a mystery. It comes out in the fall.
So my first question for all of you is really an easy one. Kind of what, for these books, what drew you guys to the mystery genre? Is it something that you read in already? And if it was, who were some of your favorites in the genre? Let's start. Oh, no.
I'll start. Okay, so I don't know if you can see because I'm wearing my Nancy Drew shirt.
Oh, I see. I see her.
My Nancy Drew shirt. Because in honor of today's panel, since I just have to say it's so exciting to do this panel because there are actually so few YA mysteries with queer protagonists. And I'm so excited that Ryan, you're here. I know your book doesn't come out for till next year, right? So
Yeah.
I'm so excited to have you here too, because the variety, I mean, mysteries are really white and they're really straight. So this is like a really great opportunity, I think, to get together and talk to you guys about this. So I grew up in reading Nancy Drew. Like this is where I started my love of mysteries, right? So then I continued reading mysteries. That's probably like the kind of book I read the most. I think people know me most for my fantasy and science fiction, but to be honest, I read a lot of crime fiction. Some of my favorite writers are obviously Tana French, who is this wonderful Irish crime fiction writer. During the coronavirus, I started reading all of those Shetland mysteries written by Anne Cleves. They're kind of like weirdly comforting. So those but you know, I also really like psychological thrillers. You know, Gone Girl was a fabulous book. I read all of Gillian Flynn's novels. And yeah, so those are some of the things that I have loved and read my whole life. But obviously, as you can tell, none of them are straight or queer. I mean, none of them are queer or feature people of color because mysteries just typically don't.
Let's go with Tom. How about you?
Well, I was a really introverted kid, and I lived in the middle of kind of a rural area with no other kids my own age, and I would invent these sort of fantasies in my head, and they always tended to revolve around me solving a murder. And I think that kind of led into sort of a natural interest in mystery and thriller and horror fiction, because there was this sort of darkness. I don't know if it was just a vibe from being kind of a burgeoning queer myself, but there was this sort of darkness in the world around me that seemed to kind of draw me in that direction to darker fiction. And so I started off with a lot of I actually was in the hospital for a stretch when I was a kid, and the children's ward in my hospital had a complete set of Nancy Drew and a complete set of Hardy Boys, and I read them all. I was there for maybe 3 weeks, and I read literally cover to cover all of these books. And that was sort of a light intro. I mean, they're such touchstones culturally, but when you go back and revisit them now, they're really quite tame. And so, you know, by the time I was 13, 14, I was shifting into, you know, a lot of Stephen King, that sort of stuff. I really like anything that's atmospheric and dark and, you know, morally, psychologically compromised. And so I think that's kind of how I got into it. And I've continued, I mean, I read mysteries, thrillers, horror more than I do anything else right now. So it's a natural fit for me.
And how about you, Kristen?
Yeah, you guys saw my answer. Nancy Drew was my girl when I was little. And then when I was 13 or so, I went through this huge Mary Higgins Clark phase. I read everything.
Yeah.
And all her protagonists were 27 and white and very beautiful. So beyond that, I stopped reading mystery for a while, I guess, with school and the things that they assign you. I just got away from it somehow, and then didn't discover that I really love mystery again until I was in the process of writing this one. And I suddenly realized I love murder mysteries, and I'm writing a murder mystery, because before that I thought I was writing something different. So I like Tana French too, that Malinda mentioned. I really liked Girl on the Train. Anything psychological where you don't quite know what's going on. I love that kind of puzzle. I love anything that's a puzzle. So.
And how about you, Ryan?
So we're going back to like the first mysteries that I started to read, probably Cam Jansen was like my thing. That's kind of how I got introduced to that genre. So I read all those books when I was in like, not middle school, but grade school. And then growing up, I got introduced to Agatha Christie, and I really fell in love with And Then There Were None as like my first like, I don't know. It was like my first like serious one, which it's like so problematic. The original edition that came out, which I don't know if you guys know, but it was super problematic, which I found out later. But I just loved it for the story and the intrigue. But I also love Gillian Flynn. I love the way she kind of creates like this grotesque, macabre feeling in like the words as well as the story. So her books kind of taught me how to bring that to the writing. Who else was there? I feel like I get inspired by different mediums as well. I get inspired by movies too. I love like horror movies, James Wan, Jordan Peele, stuff like that. I also incorporate those kinds of elements into what I write.
So Malinda touched on this a little bit about kind of how the adult mystery world is. It's very straight. It's very white. It's slowly starting to make some changes. I think the most recent Seamus Awards, most of the nominees were all either people of color or women, which is really fantastic to see. But it really seems like the YA world is really ahead of the curve on this. So we're actually starting to see some really great queer YA mystery stuff coming out. Whereas in the adult mystery world, you tended to see if there were any queer characters, they always sort of tended to be kind of on the sidelines, and very rarely did they ever make it to the end of the book. Do any of y'all have any thoughts on why kind of YA is kind of at the forefront of kind of pushing more diverse voices in mystery like that?
Well, I think YA in general is pushing diverse voices more than adult. Like, I don't know if it's just the younger generation more in touch with their own gender and sexuality identities, are more accepting and just generally awesome, or what. I think the adults wouldn't. It would be good if they would take a page out of the YA book and do more.
I think I feel as if YA does a really good job of I feel like YA is ahead of the curve in certain ways. I mean, I think that they're publishing more stuff, but when it comes to marketing support, that isn't always the case. And I'm talking about, a wide range of any sort of diverse, marginalized voices. They tend to get published earlier in YA, but I don't know if they're getting the push that the more conventional voices are getting. And my personal experience has been that's kind of what I see when I see, queer YA mysteries. There have been some that have done really, really well in the last few years, but they tend to generally take kind of second fiddle to, your more typical voices. I don't know if I'm being uncharitable, but it just kind of seems that that's the trend.
Yeah, I think that YA is, well, obviously due to decades of activism within children's and YA literature, there's been an increasing push for diversity within YA and more and broader representation. However, I do agree with Tom that even though editors are acquiring more books that are inclusive of different types of different people, there is a lag in terms of how willing publishers are to market those books to the masses. There's still a belief that, queer people read queer books, for example. So I agree that continues to be a problem. I think that actually within queer YA mysteries, it's actually very small. I think there have been very few published in the last few years, and only within the last few years. Even though YA thrillers really had a moment, like with the Karen McManus books, like that first series has been on the bestseller list for years, but I don't think there's been like a push to follow through with additional thrillers. So I think that is partly, and like, I think that partly that's because YA has a difficulty conceiving of how to market queer books outside the coming out narrative. Like, if you have a queer book, they think they're going to push it as a serious coming out narrative, and if that's not what it is, they don't exactly know what to do with it. So I think that's a little bit of an issue. But hopefully things are improving, and I hope, Ryan, that when your book comes out next year, you will have massive momentum behind you.
I hope so. My book's been delayed for a while thus far, but I hope that. Well, we launched in June, so I hope that things will get rolling. But I feel like, I mean, obviously I'm a noob, but I just get the sense that YA is in general more willing to explore books that encompass multiple things, not just like genre-wise, but in terms of identity. And I feel like adult just seems a little bit more like there are niches that you kind of have to go into. But I definitely feel like, I mean, it's just been my experience that you can't get too different because I feel like with a Black gay protagonist who's like a medium, which is, my editor seems to think that that's like so off market that we have to like introduce it into the market when there are other, like there's a rush of horror stories or other mystery stories that are like queer, which is part of the reason my book has been delayed so much. But yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that that will change because I feel like we're getting more comfortable encompassing queer identities and intersectionality, in addition to those like genre bending qualities that you find in YA.
So Malinda also touched on this. Do you guys feel that like having the framework of a mystery novel helps you be able to write a gay story that doesn't center around coming out? Does it give you kind of more freedom to tell a different story?
I feel, especially with Keep This to Yourself, which was Own Voice. I hope you're listening. It's not Own Voices. It's about a lesbian teen, and it's, you know, it was me writing out of my experience in a way that, you know, was challenging and interesting for me. But Keep This to Yourself was very clearly a story that drew on my own, you know, a lot of my own deep-seated, you know, teenage emotions. And so in one regard, I think that it absolutely allowed me to tell a mystery story. You know, I had to craft that logic puzzle, and I had to get into the psychology of all the different possible suspects. But on the other hand, I think that the queerness of my protagonist really kind of informed the telling of the story, because there's this sort of atmosphere. Small town. I grew up in a small town as a closeted gay kid, and my main character Mac is not closeted, but he's really insecure about his sexuality. And I think that that sort of natural paranoia helped lend itself to the atmosphere of the story and the vibe of the actual mystery.
I guess for me, like none of my books have really been about coming out, so I'm comfortable telling a gay story without making it being about being gay. So for me, that wasn't super different with A Line in the Dark. But I think that yeah, so I will open it up to others.
I feel like, actually, I'm gonna wait. Kristen, you go.
Well, I didn't figure out I was bi until I was like 34. So I don't have personally the teenage coming out story myself. So I don't feel that qualified to write it anyway. So I just will probably never write that story. I will leave it to people who've had that specific experience. But as far as having something other than that to tell, I think it's great. I think coming out stories are great. I think happy stories are great. I think we just need all kinds of stories with queer characters, just like everybody else.
Yeah, I agree with that. I totally appreciate the diversity of stories amongst the queer canon. I feel like I also have never written the story about coming out itself. I've always kind of wrapped it into a different kind of a different kind of genre, and I feel like I enjoy doing that, and I enjoy books that do that because it makes the queerness kind of like this incidental thing where it's like, yes, it matters. Yes, it impacts the characters. Yes, it impacts the story. But, you know, there are other things that we deal with as human beings who happen to be queer. And I enjoy stories that look at those themes and don't make the queer aspect the entire thing, because it almost feels more humanizing to me to see it just kind of stated, and then, you know, there's a killer and that has nothing to do with it. It's just kind of like a killer. So yeah, I feel empowered by stories like that personally.
I also have to say, I think I just want to add, I think that having a queer character in a story in which the queer person is not the victim is neither the victim nor the killer is at its base like extremely radical, because that's where queer people have been in these stories in the past. So I think it's really, I think that's great that we have some of these books now, and we obviously need a lot more.
One of my straight coworkers was reading something not that long ago, and she's like, "Oh, this book has this really great queer character in it. I think you're really going to love this reporter." I'm like, "Okay, if they make it to the end of the chapter that you are reading right now, I will read this book." And she came in the next day and was like, "Yeah, they didn't make it." I was like, "Yeah, you can use it. They're going to be gone." What, and Ryan talked a little bit about this as well. So what are some of the challenges of writing a young adult mystery? Because in the adult mystery world, there are all these different subgenres. There's mysteries, there's thrillers, or not mysteries, there's cozies, there's thrillers, there's espionage. There are all these things that kind of tell you what kind of mystery you're going to pick up when you do that. But with YA, it's a mystery. So what are some of the challenges of writing it and trying to balance issues like, in Tom's book, you know, this person is investigating one of their friends' death or disappearance. Or in Kristin's case, she's trying to clear her best friend of murder. Or, and Ryan, you mentioned kind of levels of darkness with horror and gothic horror. So how do you try to balance that and make it kind of appropriate for a teen audience and not make it potentially too heavy? Ryan, you want to start there?
Sure. So the way that I do it is through humor. I write really voicey books, and I enjoy kind of balancing out the darkness and the themes with just like quirky kind of it's like the POV doesn't have to be like completely miserable in order for the book to be dealing with murdery things and those dark themes, because, you know, I feel like, you know, in writing a 16-year-old boy, maybe he's a little bit goth, but he's not like completely miserable. You know, he still has this curiosity and this imagination about the world and this humor. So I definitely try to introduce more humorous elements to sort of offset the darkness as a starting point.
That's the same thing I do. My book, like, I like to read the really gritty, dark books, but apparently I can't read them. So I like them to have a little bit of humor, and I could just have my characters sitting around having snarky conversations all day, but, you know, there's also plot to happen, so.
I'm afraid I have no humor in my book.
I would love to read it.
Well, there's no, I don't know, maybe there are some jokes in A Light in the Dark, but other than that, I mean, it's pretty dark. I'm not lying to you. They do some bad things in that book, and I don't really think they regret it. So yeah, it's not the funniest book I've written. So yeah.
I'm in the same boat. I went really dark, and I kind of stayed in that mode.
Well, yeah, because Malinda, like you said, you know, in your book, I mean, these characters, you know, I think on the back of it, it's actually got like a Gone Girl comparison to it. And yeah, and I mean, it's just, you're dealing with like this, you know, young girls and obsession and this disappearance and all this stuff. So yeah, I can imagine it would be hard to kind of keep the tone of that and infuse some humor in there. So another interesting thing about YA is because you're having teens be the ones that are investigating the crimes. You know, it's not like an adult police procedural or an adult cozy mystery where an adult can just go to the police and say, hey, I want information on this, and the police are going to take them seriously. So one of the, I think the cool things about YA mysteries is that we actually get to see kind of teens investigating without a lot of times the help of adults. So I think that also potentially opens us up to be able to tell kind of more queer stories, because you don't have, you know, potentially a police officer, potentially a queer police officer who's dealing with discrimination on the force, or an adult. So do you guys have any thoughts about kind of how YA also kind of helps open up in the subset of a mystery, you be able to tell different stories like that? We touched on that a little bit earlier, but that question kind of just got away from me.
Can you rephrase a little bit?
Yeah, we were kind of when we were emailing back and forth about kind of some topics. We talked about kind of how YA mystery stories, especially queer YA mystery stories, give characters a little bit more agency, and it changes kind of the agency of who's able to tell these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, I can say something. So if we're talking like police, I generally don't include the police in my books just because I don't want to. I just don't want to give them room on the page. I also don't have many experiences with like calling the police to like get help and get them to help me solve my problems. It's more of like a situation where if I see the police, I go the other way. So I definitely love about YA that we're able to give teens the power to kind of go under those institutions or over those institutions to solve their own problems. I think that not only is like critical of how helpful those institutions really are, but I just think it's so empowering to see teens solving their own issues and finding their own way through their problems. I think for teen readers, that can be really empowering if they don't have like adults, or if they don't trust the police, or they don't trust their teachers to solve those issues for them.
Yeah, so in A Line in the Dark, there are police in it because the victim, the person who dies, I guess I shouldn't say that this person is a victim necessarily, but the person who dies is a rich white girl. So there are definitely police involved in investigating her murder, and her parents are involved. It's like a whole thing. So I knew very little bit about actual police when I started writing this book, even though I have read crime fiction my entire life. I mean, the cops in crime fiction are fiction, right? So I did this thing called Writers Police Academy, which is you go to this conference for like 3 days and they teach writers of mystery novels how the police work. I had some friends who went to it and thought it was amazing, and so I went. I was completely horrified. Like from the minute I got there, I was just like, what the hell's happening? Get me out of here. It was literally like, I was like the only person of color. I'm pretty sure I was the only queer person. And everybody else there was like so pro police. It was intense. And I do not think they intended it for me to come away thinking the police are insane. However, that is what I took from this weekend. So afterward, I realized I was writing this novel in which there were nice detectives in it, because I literally hadn't thought about it in this way before. So I had to really think about how to deal with that in this book, because I was pretty far along at that point. I couldn't necessarily change it entirely. And I'd also started doing a lot of reading about interrogations, which are messed up. Like police interrogations are insanely messed up. And there were several interrogations in my book that are presented in like a script format almost. And so I made the conscious decision to have these police officers actually be good police officers who did not have terrible interrogations with the witnesses. However, the main characters in the book don't necessarily like submit to the police interrogations. Like they're kind of devious. I will not say that the police got the right person at the end necessarily, because these teenagers are kind of manipulating them in a way that the police do not understand, because they discount teenagers. You know what I mean? Like that's just the case. Adults always are discounting teenagers. So this actually is very useful when plotting a YA murder mystery, because you know that the adults are not going to believe them. So that was a really interesting and fun way to play with those authority roles, I think, in my book.
I have I think like a lot of us, my perspectives and my views on the police in society generally are very rapidly evolving. And I think even before this year kind of threw everything just out on the table, I was already thinking about this. And with Keep This to Yourself, there's a very important, the turning point in the book, the moment when everything starts to get rolling, is when my main character, Mac, finds a note that his victim best friend had left him a year ago on the night that he died, basically saying, I think I know who this serial killer is and I need your help. And Mac had overlooked this note and found it a year later. And this kind of gets the story going. And he's kind of racked with guilt over the fact that he found this note too late and maybe he could have helped him. And his first instinct as, you know, an upper middle class white kid from a suburban neighborhood is to take it straight to the cops. And so he goes to the local small town police chief, and she kind of shoots him down, and that sends him off on his own detective mission. And looking back on that, when I started to write I Hope You're Listening, which is my next mystery, I realized and then that cop comes back into the story and she has her own role to play. But it was such a natural thing for me to write from my own, you know, because of my own unconscious biases, that his first instinct would be to automatically go and think that the voice of authority would be the police. And that stuck with me. And as I was writing that story, another character kind of emerged who was the black cousin of one of the other victims. And when they come up with another clue, Max says, we should take this to the cops and see what they say. And this other character says, that's the last thing. I don't want to go to the cops. Let's figure this out on our own. But by the time I came to I Hope You're Listening, I had started to realize that it was such a natural, easy thing for me to put on the page. And that was a problematic decision in itself, that I wanted to embed something bit more nuanced in I Hope You're Listening. There's no murder in I Hope You're Listening. It's a missing persons story, and it revolves around a teen girl who witnessed her best friend's abduction when they were kids, and her friend disappeared and they were never seen again. And to deal with the guilt over this, you know, there's basically survivor's guilt. The main character, Dee, starts a true crime podcast where she tries to help solve missing persons cases with the help of an online, she calls them the laptop detective agency. And so throughout the book, there's this mystery that's happening on the page, but it's also interspersed with podcast episodes that are trying to figure out other stories that are happening elsewhere. And so the story that ends up happening off screen, which is the podcast episode, or the podcast story, is about a black woman and a Latina woman from Houston, actually, who have gone missing, and the families have gotten in touch with her podcast, basically saying the cops are not taking us seriously. They think that they're, you know, basically responsible for their own disappearance. And, you know, the more I read about it, and I was aware of the fact that if you're, you know, a young white girl who goes missing, you're going to get a lot of attention. And if you're a young black girl who goes missing, the police attention on the case is basically, you know, next to nothing. There's a lot of runaway assumptions. And so I tried to embed that, keeping distant enough from it that it wasn't my story to tell, but I wanted to make it clear in the story that there tend to be two ways to approach the police. There's those of us who have never had to deal with the repercussions of dealing with police, and then there is everybody else. And so I don't know if I succeeded, but I think it's something that we all are responsible for paying a lot of attention to, because it's kind of hard to get away in a crime book from having, you know, the cops at least, you know, marginal on the edges.
I know for mine, my main characters all work at an illegal speakeasy. It's the 20s. And so they all have a dubious view of the cops to begin with. And so that only got worse. Like, my main character was never going to trust them. And nobody in the book trusts the cops, basically. At one point, her mom, who is kind of awful, says something like, well, not all cops. And she's like, just cuts her off and is like, I don't want to hear anything about that. And there is one cop who is not terrible, but I try to be really careful not all cops him. He happens to be an okay guy and is actually doing a thorough job, but he's working within a system that's corrupt. And I wanted my main character to never let him off the hook for that. And I didn't want to let him off the hook for it. And I did a lot of research about police brutality historically towards queer people and people of color. I mean, my book's set in New Orleans. A lot of bad shit happened. And I read lots of newspapers, and just the way the newspaper talked about, like, if there was a raid, they would say what race everyone was, and it was just so obvious who was getting arrested and who wasn't. and it made me really mad. And so I was mad at the cops all while I wrote this book, and I think that shows a little bit too.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of what happens in the genre now. Hopefully that people are paying kind of more attention. I've seen a couple of mystery authors kind of talk about how, you know, police are portrayed in books, or even if we look at just media in general, TV shows like Law and Order. I saw that the TV show Cops got canceled. So it's really interesting to see kind of potentially what's going to happen to the genre in the next couple of years if people are kind of really listening and paying attention, like kind of I hope everybody is. I have just a couple more questions for y'all. Next one is, since you have all written a mystery, are you guys plotters or pantsers? Did you know kind of where the book was going to end up when you were done, or were you surprised?
I was totally surprised. I literally had to rewrite this book 3 times. The ending was different every time. So if you read it and you're like, what is happening? I had the same idea. I had the same reaction. Like I did not, I mean, I think I made it work at the end, but I did not know. And I had planned it. I planned this book so thoroughly, and yet clearly that did not work. So I don't know what that says.
It definitely worked, Melinda. It worked really well.
Thank you, Tom.
I was with Keep This to Yourself, which has, you know, it's very twisty. I felt like it was one of those rare moments where I had the gift of a perfect opening scene and the perfect ending scene before I started writing. And so I always knew what I was working towards. And I tend to be a plotter anyway. I usually spend a couple of months getting things as organized as possible, leaving myself some room to breathe, but I want as much of a roadmap as possible before I actually start putting words on paper. And with this one, I felt like I had a really good ending, and I just had to make my way in that direction. And so that worked. With I Hope You're Listening, it was very different. I kind of figured it out as I went along. I like to know where I'm going, but it helps my anxiety a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also, well, I'm a vague plotter. I'm not like a plotter who plots every single moment out, but I like to know, you know, a few key plot points and the middle and the ending. And then from there, I just fill in the gaps, and it gets kind of crazy because, you know, at a certain point, the characters start to tell you what they want to do. And then you're just kind of like in negotiations with your characters and trying to wrap the world and the plotting around how they grow and evolve, which, you know, I don't know how many times I rewrote Jake in the Box. Several.
I am also a plotter. I think I'm an obsessive plotter because you mentioned anxiety, Tom. I have a lot of that. So plus, it's a great way to procrastinate actually ever writing a book. So if you make a 15,000 word outline, then you're halfway there. Well, not halfway, but I end up writing like whole scenes in my outline. And I also rewrote this book a billion times despite that, and I changed my killer 5 times. So when people say that it worked out, like you said, Melinda, when people are saying I was surprised by the ending, I was like, good. I'm glad I changed it a lot.
Yeah, I just say, Melinda, I thought it was really genius that, you know, for most of the book, it's all first person. Then all of a sudden you hit this point where it's like, you know, the police interviews, and then all of a sudden it's like third person. You're getting all of these different perspectives. And it's like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? Because you just don't see that happen very often. So that was a really interesting way to tell the story. And so, Ryan, I had a question for you. Since your novel kind of blends horror elements with mystery elements, when you started it, did you think you were writing specifically in one genre and then kind of the other one crept in, or did you know it was going to be a hybrid?
I feel like it actually didn't become a mystery until it sold. In the beginning, it was very much just a horror novel. But I feel like horror is not something that we see a lot, to where like you could just like, especially in YA, it's kind of hard to just say like, this is a horror novel. You know, if you say that, I feel like people don't really know what to expect. And people are kind of like, what does that mean? You know, it's definitely a medium that we're used to seeing more, at least in today's day and age, on screen. But my editor actually walked me through like plotting things that would make the story more easy to walk through. And then I started to introduce like murders, people die, and Jake kind of has to figure out what's at the bottom of that, and that kind of threads the story through. I feel like when I was just writing it as a horror novel, it was a lot more chaotic, and I like writing like these really dramatic horror pieces where it's like poltergeists in the house and kind of like there's a little bit of slasher in there as well, but it just felt a little bit choppy without that thread of mystery to kind of, you know, it's like boxes are opening throughout now and you kind of get the horror, but you also get the mystery and it feels more cohesive and coherent. So that's what happened with that.
So then last couple questions. What are you guys all working on next?
Kristen, you have to say something because you made such a face.
Oh, no. I'm kind of working on a middle grade mystery now, set in a famous amusement park, and where they have to go behind the scenes of this amusement park, and because they're very strict there at, I don't know, I guess I could just say Disney World, because it's not going to be in the book. It's going to be some other world, but you know, kind of a spoof of there. But they're very strict about going behind the scenes there. Like I had a friend who was there in high school for choir, and they ripped her camera out of her hand because they thought she took pictures backstage. So
That happened to me. Oh my God.
To explore a really serious security team and some kids having to find their aunt who disappears on the Pirates of the Caribbean-esque ride. So that's what I'm playing with now. But it hasn't gotten very far.
That happened to me when I went to see Newsies. I tried to take a picture of the cast bowing, and a lady came and like knocked my phone out of my hand.
Oh my God.
It was just really dramatic, and I realized that how like dramatic they are about copyright and that. But I can, since I'm talking, I'll just say I'm working on a rom-com right now, which is a complete deviation from what I usually do, but it's a nice breath of fresh air after being, you know, taken to the pits of hell. I guess I took myself to the pits of hell writing Jake in the Box, but it's nice to come to something different and get like a breath of fresh air. But I'm writing about these two black boys who fall in love in a beach town over one summer, which is really chaotic and very opposites attract. One of the boys is a kid who just got thrown out of his house and is trying to find a new life for himself via nightlife and sex work. So he gets involved in like the clubs and the scene and gets swept up into that world. And the other boy is a boy who was set for like this amazing college course, but then had a breakdown and his GPA suffered. So now he's taking a gap year and studying marine photography in this town. And he meets this boy, and his sort of like, I guess, nerdy academic world is overturned by this kid who's so off the rails. And I'm just enjoying writing a story that's romantic and not so heavy this time. So, yeah.
Well, I just finished something about a month ago, and it's 1980s kind of Reagan era satanic panic heavy metal rock opera style with a demonic possession mystery at the center of it. I really love this book. I'm so excited about this book. I think it's pretty good. And it's basically about a gay teen in a small town, which is my thing. And he lives with his grandparents, and his grandfather is the local fire and brimstone preacher. And so he's clearly very closeted, but he gets drawn into the orbit of this charismatic female lead singer for a kind of a glam heavy metal band. And things kind of spiral from there. And it becomes this culture clash where there's this metal contingent going up against these, you know, religious right, I don't know, religion, and yeah, it's been lots of fun to write. It has a great title that I'm not gonna spill here, but stay tuned.
You can email.
I can't. I'm very superstitious about titles. Until I sell something, I don't tell people. Sorry.
Well, I'll tell you about my next book because It's not coming out till January, but that's my next book. So it's called Last Night at the Telegraph Club, and it is a historical novel. As everyone knows, I jump around from genre to genre. So the next genre I'm doing is historical. It's 1950s San Francisco, and it's about this Chinese American girl who is discovering that she is a lesbian, and also that 2 blocks away from Chinatown is North Beach, where there are a whole lot of gay bars. So it's basically about, like, I had a friend read it, and she was like, how did you manage to write a YA novel about going out to gay bars? and I have, and that's what it's about. And it's about falling in love for the first time. And it's set in the 1950s, so there's certainly homophobia and racism and McCarthyism. It's all happening at that same time, but it is ultimately, and I don't think this is a spoiler to say, it is ultimately a very hopeful story about first love, and I'm really excited for it to come out.
Awesome. Wait, have you read Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold?
Yes.
Okay, we have to talk about it later.
So last question I have for everybody is, what is something that you have read recently that you absolutely love? Mine, other than the stuff for you guys on the panel, because I've been reading all week and I've loved all of y'all's books, and Ryan, I can't wait to get to yours when galleys are over already. Adult-wise, I just read Abby Collette's The Deadly Insects, which is a really fun, cozy mystery set in an ice cream store. And then YA-wise, I just reread Casey Calendar's Hurricane Child, because they're just really beautiful, and I wanted to think it's short and wonderful. So how about you guys?
I just finished Maureen Johnson's is it The Vanishing Stare? That's
yeah.
The second. I finished the third in that series. Oh, Truly Devious, the Truly Devious series. Super good. I love them. And I think that she's done something really great with, she took these really 1930s golden age of mystery conventions, you know, like the boarding school in the hills and the, you know, locked room mysteries, and she, you know, that jazz era sort of Gatsby vibe, and she made it very contemporary, and she brought some really wonderful characters onto the page. I love them. I can't say enough about that series.
So I just read Varian Johnson's The Parker Inheritance, which is a middle grade mystery about I'm sorry, I just heard something. It's a great little mystery about 2 Black kids in the South who get engaged in this historical mystery involving the small town's racist past, really. But it's a wonderful book. It's set during the summer. The kids are so adorable. The mystery they're investigating is totally rooted in amazing historical research, and the sense of place is just wonderful. And Varian Johnson, the author, is also a wonderful guy. So I highly recommend it if you know kids who love mysteries. It's a lot like The Westing Game. Is that the name of that book? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of puzzles in it that are really fun to solve. And I did not actually solve them. I failed. But it was a wonderful book to read.
I just finished reading Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. I think it's Tiffany D. Or is it Tiffany A? Anyway, Tiffany Jackson, and it was amazing. And basically, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna now read everything she ever writes. It was one of those, and it's about a Black girl missing in Washington D.C. and her friends finding her, and no one seems to care. And it was what is happening?
Oh, sorry.
I'm done. You can go.
Oh, my bad. Okay. I was just looking at my shelves. I was trying to find a YA. I'm actually listening to, well, I'm halfway through the audiobook for This Is Kind of an Epic Love Story by Kristin Lambert, which is super funny and fun, and I'm enjoying it so much. It's really giving me inspo for my rom-com. But the most recent book that I read was Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, which is a really good deep dive into abolition literacy, just like the abolition of police and prisons, and, you know, the history of them, and how we can sort of as a society collectively turn to less authoritative modes of solving issues and turn toward social programs and community programs that I guess reframe the way that we think about the role that the police have to serve in society and how we can serve our communities in healthier and safer ways. So that was a really good book, and it opened my mind up a lot.
So I think we are right around where we should be time-wise. Thank you guys so much again for inviting me to do this. It was really great hanging out with you guys this afternoon. And thanks to Kidlit Pride for putting on this festival. I can't wait to see what everybody thinks of it. So thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.